They will never say this to you, not because the words do not exist somewhere inside them, not because the truth of it is absent, but because the entire architecture of how they move through the world, through relationships, through intimacy, through the specific territory of being close to another human being, was built precisely to ensure that this particular kind of honesty never reaches the surface, never becomes air, never crosses the distance between their interior and yours. But it is there, underneath the withdrawal, underneath the deflection, underneath the coolness that descended without warning, and the distance that arrived without adequate explanation. Underneath every non-answer and every redirected conversation and every moment where you felt the connection almost arrive and then watched it retreat, underneath all of it, something true has always been living. Something that, if the defense ever fully dropped, if the fear ever went quiet long enough for the real voice to speak, would sound something like this. If the dismissive avoidant were honest, fully unguardedly, without the protection of the self-sufficiency narrative they have constructed so carefully over so many years, they would tell you something that would reframe everything you thought you understood about their behavior. They would tell you that needing you terrified them in a way that had nothing to do with you specifically. That the need itself, the raw, unchosen, involuntary experience of genuinely wanting another person's presence, felt like a betrayal of the self they had built. Like a crack in a structure they had spent a lifetime reinforcing. Like the first sign of a collapse they were certain was coming, and were equally certain they could not survive. They would tell you that when they went cold, it was not because the warmth had gone, it was because the warmth had become too much to safely contain. That pulling back was not the absence of feeling, but the overflow management of too much of it, arriving at once in a system that was never designed to hold that volume. They would tell you, if they were honest, if the words were available, if the interior permission existed to speak them, that they knew. They knew what they were doing when they created the distance. They knew, at some level beneath the rationalizations, that the reasons they were offering were not the real reasons. That the incompatibility they cited, the timing they blamed, the practical concerns they elevated into deal breakers, all of it was architecture, constructed after the fact to make the emotional exit look like a logical one. The dismissive avoidant, if they were sitting with you right now in the full discomfort of complete honesty, would say something like this. I told myself I did not need you. I practiced not needing you. I got very good at the performance of someone who was complete without you. And the performance worked, mostly, in the hours when I was occupied. In the hours when there was enough noise and enough motion to keep the interior quiet. But in the spaces, in the early mornings before I had rebuilt the day's defenses, in the late evenings when the busyness ran out, I could feel the specific shape of your absence. Not a general loneliness. The particular shape of you not being there. And I would notice it, and then I would do what I always do. I would find a way to make the noticing smaller. To reclassify it. To convert it into something more manageable than what it actually was. What it actually was missing you. I was missing you, and I had left, or pushed, or made the space between us wide enough that missing you felt like the safer option. And I could not tell you that, because telling you that would have meant undoing the distance. And the distance was the only thing keeping the fear at a volume I could function inside of. This is the interior monologue the dismissive avoidant never delivers. The admission that the self-sufficiency was always partly performance. That the independence was genuine in some ways and constructed in others. Constructed specifically in the places where genuine connection was pressing against the walls of what felt survivable. Because the dismissive avoidant's core wound is not that they do not want connection. It is that they do, and they were taught, early and effectively, that wanting it was a liability. That the wanting would not be met, or would be met inconsistently, or would be met with a quality of response that made the original wanting feel foolish in retrospect. And the psyche, adaptive and efficient, drew its conclusion and built its system accordingly. The system said, want less, need less. Arrange the interior so that the absence of what you want does not register as loss. Become as completely as possible someone who genuinely does not require the things that can be taken away. And the system worked, up to a point. It worked until you arrived, until the specific quality of what you offered pressed against the system in a way that the usual management could not fully contain. Now the fearful avoidant. Because this is a different architecture, a different wound, a different texture of honesty, and it deserves its own examination. The fearful avoidant, if they were stripped of every defense and asked to speak from the actual center of their experience, would say something that sounds almost contradictory. something that contains in its very structure the paradox that defines their entire relational existence. They would say, "I wanted you more than I have wanted anything in recent memory, and that wanting was the most frightening thing I have ever felt." Not frightening in a manageable way. Frightening in the way that activates every alarm the nervous system has available. Frightening in the way that produces the simultaneous desperate desire to move towards you and the equally desperate, equally physical compulsion to move away. Not sequentially, not first one and then the other, but at the same time with the same intensity, pulling in opposite directions inside a bottle that had no adequate protocol for resolving the conflict. The fearful avoidant lives inside that conflict. It is not a passing state. It is the chronic condition of their intimate life, the wanting and the terror of the wanting, coexisting without resolution, producing the push-pull behavior that is the most visible signature of this particular attachment pattern. If the fearful avoidant were honest, they would tell you that every time they move towards you, every moment of genuine closeness, every lowering of the guard, every instance of real contact between their actual self and yours, was followed inevitably by a period of internal alarm that had nothing to do with anything you did. That the closeness itself triggered the alarm. That the more real the connection became, the louder the warning signal got. Not because the connection was wrong, because it was right, because it was real enough to lose. They would tell you that the sabotage, and they would call it that if they were being fully honest, because that is what it was not a deliberate act of cruelty. It was a panicked, largely unconscious, reflexive response to the sensation of having something genuinely at stake, of being in a position where loss was possible in the specific devastating way that only real attachment makes possible. The fearful avoidant is not afraid of you. They are afraid of what caring about you makes them. Of the version of themselves that exists when the connection is active, soft, open, genuinely needing, genuinely hoping, because that version of themselves is the version that has been hurt before, badly, early, in circumstances that did not give them the developmental resources to metabolize the hurt in a way that left the openness intact. The fearful avoidant, in their most honest voice, would say something like this: "I did to you what was done to me, not intentionally, not with the conscious desire to cause what I knew how to cause from the inside. But the pattern ran deeper than my intentions. It ran in the part of me that does not consult my intentions before it acts. When I felt closest to you, something in me began preparing for the end of it. Not because the end was coming, but because that is what closeness has always preceded in the experience that lives deepest in my nervous system. And that preparation looked, from where you were standing, like withdrawal, like cooling, like the beginning of the end. And maybe it was. Maybe the preparation became the thing it was preparing for. Maybe the bracing for loss created enough distance to make the loss more likely. I do not know how to fully separate those threads. I do not know, even now, in the honest quiet of this, whether the ending was inevitable or whether I made it inevitable because I could not stop waiting for it. What I know is that I loved you in the specific, terrified way of someone who was certain that loving you was going to cost me something enormous. And I could not figure out how to love you without that certainty running underneath everything. Without the fear being present in every moment of warmth as the thing that would eventually extinguish the warmth. And I was so tired of waiting for the extinguishing that I think, in some moments, I did it myself. Just to have it be over, just to replace the anticipatory terror with the known, familiar, survivable pain of loss that has already happened. That is the fearful avoidance confession, the one that never gets made, the one that lives in the body rather than the vocabulary, the one that would explain so much of what felt inexplicable from the outside. They chose the pain they knew over the joy they could not trust. Not because the joy was not real, because the joy was so real that losing it felt unsurvivable in advance. And unsurvivable in advance is the most dangerous category of feeling available to a psyche that was formed in early experiences of genuine emotional injury. Both types, the dismissive and the fearful, share something underneath the different surface presentations of their patterns. They share the foundational belief that genuine intimacy is a fundamentally unsafe condition, that the self that exists in close, honest, mutual connection with another person is a self that is exposed in ways that history has consistently punished. The dismissive learned to preempt that exposure by becoming someone who did not need closeness in the first place, by constructing a self-concept organized around independence as a value rather than a defense, by genuinely, through the alchemy of prolonged suppression, partially convincing themselves that the need was not there. The fearful never managed that convincing. The need remained visible to them, achingly, inconveniently, embarrassingly visible, which is why their relationship with intimacy is so much more turbulent. They cannot pretend they do not want it. They can only cycle between wanting it and fleeing from it, wanting it and sabotaging it, wanting it and quietly, desperately wishing they were built differently. If both types were honest, genuinely, completely, without the protection of their respective defenses, there is something they would both say, something that lives underneath the dismissive's cool self-sufficiency and the fearful's turbulent push-pull, something that is the same in both, the shared root beneath the different expressions. They would say, "I did not know how to let you stay." Not that they did not want you to stay, not that staying was the wrong outcome, but that the interior conditions for allowing genuine, sustained, undefended closeness were not available to them. That something in the way they were built by experiences they did not choose, in circumstances they did not design, at ages when they had no alternative but to adapt to what was present, made the simple act of letting love be simple genuinely inaccessible. I did not know how to let you stay, and I do not know how to tell you that. And so I told you other things that made more surface sense, things that put the incompatibility somewhere outside myself, things that allowed me to leave or push or reduce without having to fully face what I was actually doing. I told you it was timing, I told you it was circumstance. I told you some version of the story where the ending was reasonable and no one's fault in particular. I did not tell you that I was afraid, that the specific shape of my fear had your name on it. That you, specifically, the quality of your presence, the depth of what you offered, the particular way you made the interior of a moment feel worth inhabiting, were the thing that made the fear loudest, because you were the thing that made the stakes highest. I did not tell you that the withdrawal was grief in advance, that the distance was preemptive mourning, that I was already losing you in my head before I had actually lost you, and that losing you in my head first was the only way I knew to make the real loss survivable. There is another layer of honesty that both avoidant types would arrive at, if the conversation went deep enough, past the admission of fear, past the acknowledgement of the defense, into the territory that is the most uncomfortable of all, the territory of what they actually believe about themselves. Both the dismissive and the fearful avoidant, underneath the different presentations, underneath the different ways of managing the wound, carry a version of the same core belief, a belief that was formed before they had the cognitive or emotional resources to examine it. A belief that has been operating at the foundation of their relational life ever since, shaping every dynamic from the inside without ever being fully brought into the light. The belief is this: I am not someone who gets to be fully loved, not as an intellectual position, not as something they would state if asked directly. Both types would deny it. The dismissive with the confidence of someone who has convinced themselves they do not need full love. The fearful with the anguish of someone who desperately wants to believe otherwise. But as a felt, body-level, pre-verbal operating premise, a conclusion drawn from early evidence and never successfully overturned by later experience. That belief is what your love pressed against. That is why your best was disorienting rather than simply welcomed. Because your love, the full, genuine, unperformed quality of it, was inconsistent with the belief. It was evidence against the premise. And evidence against a deeply held belief does not automatically update the belief. It creates conflict. It produces the particular dissonance of being offered something that contradicts the most fundamental story one tells about oneself. For the dismissive, that dissonance gets resolved by diminishing the evidence, by finding reasons why the love is not quite as real as it appears, or why the person offering it does not quite see clearly enough to be trusted, or why the connection is ultimately less substantial than it seems in the unguarded moments. For the fearful, the dissonance gets resolved through the push-pull by cycling between receiving the evidence and fleeing from it, moving toward the love when the belief is quiet, and away from it when the belief reasserts itself. Never able to stay in either position long enough to actually resolve the conflict. What both of them would say, if honesty went all the way to the bottom, is this: I did not know what to do with someone who saw me clearly, and stayed anyway. I did not have a protocol for that. Every map I had ever been given suggested that being fully seen leads to being left. And you were fully seeing me and you were not leaving, and I did not know what to do with the gap between what I expected and what you were actually doing. So I closed the gap myself. I created the leaving that I was certain was coming. I made the thing I feared into the thing I caused. Because at least that way I was not waiting. At least that way the story made a kind of terrible sense. I am sorry. Not in the way that asks you to do anything with the apology. not in the way that expects it to change what happened or restore what was lost or give you something you can use, but in the genuine way. In the way of someone who can see, in the specific clarity that honesty finally makes available, what was offered and what was done with it. You offered something real, something that deserved to be received with the same quality of presence that it was given. I gave you a defense instead. And somewhere in the silence where I keep the things I will not say, I know exactly what that cost. Both of us. The cost is not abstract, that is the thing about it. It does not live in the realm of hypothetical loss or philosophical regret. It lives in the specific, textured, sensory reality of ordinary moments that became marked by absence. By the thing that was not said, by the version of the dynamic that was always just slightly less than what it could have been, because one person was perpetually spending the majority of their available interior energy on managing the fear rather than inhabiting the connection. The cost lived in every conversation that stopped just before it reached somewhere real, in every moment of genuine closeness that was followed reliably by the subtle withdrawal that reset the temperature to something more manageable. In every instance of you extending something honest and feeling it land not in the open hands of someone ready to receive it, but in the careful, measured response of someone who was deciding in real time how much of what they actually felt was safe to return. You felt that cost. You may not have named it immediately. You may have explained it away, rationalized it, extended the benefit of the doubt with the generosity that genuine love tends to produce. But the body keeps an accurate register of these things, even when the mind is constructing more charitable interpretations. And somewhere in the body, in the accumulated cellular memory of all those almost moments, the cost was being recorded. The honest avoidant, the fully uncomfortably stripped of every defense honest avoidant, would acknowledge that cost, would not minimize it or reframe it or redistribute it into some more equitable accounting where the responsibility is shared so evenly that their specific contribution to the damage becomes diluted beyond recognition. They would say, I made you feel uncertain about something that should have been certain. I made you question the validity of what you were feeling in a dynamic where your feelings were entirely valid. I created enough ambiguity through the inconsistency, through the warmth that arrived and then retreated, through the connection that felt real and then became managed, that you began to doubt your own reading of the situation. And that doubt, that specific, disorienting, quietly destabilizing doubt, was not an accident. It was not an innocent byproduct of my confusion. It was the functional result of someone who needed the other person to remain slightly uncertain, because certainty in you would have demanded a corresponding certainty from me. And certainty, in the direction of genuine commitment, genuine presence, genuine emotional exposure, was the thing I was least equipped to offer. I kept you uncertain because your uncertainty gave me room to stay without fully arriving, room to be in the connection without being accountable to it, room to receive what you were offering without having to match its quality with an equal quality of my own. That was not fair. There is no version of honesty that makes it fair. Both the dismissive and the fearful avoidant, in their honest voice, would arrive at the admission of what the uncertainty cost the person they were supposed to be building something with. Because the uncertainty is not a neutral condition. It is not simply the emotional weather of an ambiguous relationship. It has effects, specific, traceable, lasting effects on the psychology of the person living inside it. When someone you love is consistently inconsistent, when the warmth is real but unreliable, when the closeness arrives and then retreats without adequate explanation, when the connection feels genuine in one moment and strangely distant in the next, the mind begins a search for causality. A search that is entirely natural, entirely human, and almost entirely directed in the wrong direction. The search goes inward, because inward is where the most data is available, because the self is the variable that feels most controllable, most subject to adjustment, most likely to yield a different outcome if the right modification is found. And so the person on the receiving end of avoidant inconsistency begins, often without realizing it, the slow and damaging project of trying to figure out what version of themselves produces the warmth and what version produces the distance. They begin editing themselves, subtly, incrementally, not in the obvious ways that would be immediately recognizable as self-betrayal, but in the small, almost imperceptible ways that accumulate over time into something significant. A slight softening of directness here, a slight suppression of need there, a recalibration of how much fullness to bring into a given interaction based on the avoidant's apparent temperature that day. The honest avoidant would look at that and feel the specific weight of what it means, that their inconsistency, their inability to show up with the steadiness that genuine relationship requires, produced in the person who loved them a gradual erosion of self-expression. A conditioning, however unintentional, towards smallness, toward the version of the self that the avoidance nervous system could most easily remain proximate to without triggering the full activation of the fear response. They would say, "I made you smaller without asking you to be. I did not issue the instruction. I simply responded more easily to the smaller version, and you loving me and wanting to keep what we had, learned to lead with that version. And I let you. I let you make yourself more manageable for my benefit, and I did not name what was happening, and I did not stop it, and I did not tell you that the fullness, the real, complete, unedited fullness of you was not the problem, was never the problem. The problem was my capacity to hold it, and I let you believe otherwise." This is perhaps the most important confession in the entire honest accounting of what both avoidant types would say if the defense dropped completely. The admission that the editing was permitted, that the gradual diminishment of the other person was not only not prevented, but was at some functional level accommodated, allowed to continue because it served the avoidance need for a dynamic that did not press too hard against the walls of their defended interior. The dismissive avoidant accommodated it through approval, through being warmer, more available, more relaxed in the moments when the other person was less fully themselves, through the subtle but consistent reward of closeness when the stakes felt lower and the emotional demand felt lighter. The fearful avoidant accommodated it through relief, through the moments when the other person's reduced fullness meant the fearful avoidance alarm system was less activated, when the push-pull cycle temporarily settled into the pull phase because the pressure of genuine depth had been, however, briefly reduced. Both forms of accommodation communicated the same message without stating it. The message that said, "This version of you, the quieter, less certain, less fully present version, is the version I can be with most easily." And the recipient of that message, processing it not as language but as relational pattern, adjusted accordingly. The honest avoidant would also tell you something about what happened in the moments when the full version of you appeared anyway. When the editing broke down, or when the particular circumstances of a moment made it impossible to be anything other than completely yourself, your depth fully present, your clarity fully active, your love fully visible and unmanaged and real. They would tell you that those moments were the ones that stayed, that whatever recollection they carry of the dynamic, whatever texture of memory lives in the aftermath of the separation, is composed disproportionately of those moments, the ones where you were most fully yourself, the ones that were, paradoxically, the hardest to be present for and the most impossible to forget. You were most yourself in the moments I was least able to meet you, and I have thought about that more than I have thought about almost anything else from the time we were in this together. The moments when you stopped editing and just arrived, completely honestly, without the modification that the dynamic had been slowly teaching you, and I felt the full weight of what you were, and I did not know how to hold it, and I made the distance larger. And then I carried those moments out with me, into the silence, into the aftermath, into the hours that were supposed to feel like relief and instead felt like the specific, unglamorous grief of someone who stood next to something rare and chose a smaller life. There is something both avoidant types share in the honest account of what they would say that has not yet been named directly, something that lives underneath the fear, underneath the defense, underneath even the grief of the acknowledged loss. It is shame. Not guilt, though guilt is present too. Shame is the deeper thing. Guilt says I did something wrong. Shame says I am something wrong. And the avoidant, in the fully honest interior of their experience, tends to carry an enormous amount of shame about the specific shape of their limitation. About the fact that what most people seem to manage, the basic act of remaining present and available in genuine intimate connection, is the thing they find most difficult. About the gap between who they want to be in relationship and who they consistently pattern level behaviorally are. The dismissive manages the shame by converting it into pride. By building an identity around the limitation, reframing the inability to need as the choice not to need, reframing the defended interior as a deliberately cultivated independence, reframing the emotional unavailability as emotional self-sufficiency. The shame is buried under a value system that elevates the very qualities that are actually symptoms. The fearful avoidant cannot complete that conversion. The shame sits closer to the surface. It arrives most acutely in the aftermath of the push-pull cycle, in the recognition of what was just done to someone who did not deserve it, in the exhausted, post-activation clarity of someone who can see exactly what the pattern just cost, and who feels, In that seeing, a sorrow that has no adequate outlet. If both were honest, the shame would sound something like this. I am embarrassed by my own pattern, not in the way that produces change, not yet, perhaps not yet, but in the way that produces the particular internal cringe of someone who can see themselves clearly from the outside and does not like what the view reveals. I can see what I did, I can see the shape of it, the way I moved toward you and then away, the way I gave you enough to keep the hope alive without giving you enough to build the certainty you deserved. The way I participated in something that cost you more than it cost me, not because your pain was more real, but because you were the one who stayed open, while I was the one who kept a hand on the exit. I can see it, and I carry it, and I do not know what to do with the carrying. I have not yet found the version of myself that knows how to put it down. That knows how to take the seeing and convert it into something different, into the change behavior, the genuine growth, the actual arrival that the shame is pointing toward, but that the fear continues to make feel impossible. I want to be different. I want to be the person who could have stayed and been present, and let what was real between us become everything it had the capacity to become. I want that version of myself to be available, and I do not yet know how to find it. I do not yet know if I am willing to do what finding it would require. That last line is the most honest thing either avoidant type could say. The admission that wanting to be different and choosing to do the work of becoming different are not the same thing. That the insight, however clear, however genuine, however accompanied by real feeling, does not automatically translate into the sustained, difficult, uncomfortable labor of actually reorganizing the interior structures that produce the pattern. Because that labor is real. It is not the work of a single honest conversation, or a moment of tearful recognition, or even a period of genuine grief and reflection. It is the prolonged, non-linear, frequently discouraging work of sitting with the discomfort that the defense was built to prevent, of feeling the fear without immediately acting on it, of allowing genuine intimacy to press against the walls of the defended self and choosing again and again not to exit. It requires help, usually. The kind of sustained, skilled, therapeutic relationship that provides the conditions under which new relational experience can actually update old relational programming. It requires time. It requires the particular motivation that tends to arrive only when the cost of staying the same has finally undeniably exceeded the cost of changing. And it requires something the avoidant may not yet have, something that cannot be given by the person who loved them, cannot be produced by the quality of the love that was offered, cannot be generated by patience or understanding, or the willingness to wait. It requires the avoidant's own decision, their own genuine, uncoerced, internally motivated choice to stop outsourcing the discomfort of intimacy to the people who love them and start sitting with it themselves. That decision belongs to them entirely. You cannot make it for them, you could not have made it for them at any point in the dynamic, however much you loved them, however extraordinary the quality of that love, however clearly it demonstrated that the risk of genuine connection was worth taking. The decision is theirs, and your life, the real, full, forward-moving entirety of it, does not wait for someone else's decision to begin. It has always been beginning, with or without their honesty, with or without their arrival. With or without the confession that will probably never come in the form you deserve to hear it. You already know what they would say if they were honest. You have always known. You felt it in every moment the words did not come. The knowing is its own kind of closure, not the closure that arrives with a conversation that finally says everything that needed to be said. Not the closure of a clean ending, where both people speak their truth and the air clears and something genuinely resolves, but the quieter, more durable closure of a person who has stopped waiting for the external confirmation of what their own interior already holds with complete accuracy. You knew what was happening inside them, not in every detail, not with the full psychological vocabulary that might have made it easier to name in real time, but in the felt sense that the body maintains regardless of what the mind chooses to believe. You knew when the warmth was genuine and when it was managed. You knew when the connection was real and when it was being carefully rationed. You knew the difference between the moments when they were actually present and the moments when they were physically there, but had placed the most essential part of themselves somewhere you could not reach. You knew, and you loved them anyway. And that loving anyway was not a failure of perception, it was a choice. A genuine, eyes-open choice to extend care towards someone whose capacity for receiving it was limited, in the hope, the entirely reasonable and entirely human hope, that the care itself might eventually become the conditions under which the capacity expanded. It did not. Not enough, not in the way that the dynamic needed it to, for the dynamic to become what it was trying to become. And the knowing of that, the full, undefended acknowledgement of that, is where the actual release lives. Because here is what the honest avoidance unspoken confession ultimately gives you, even in its absence. Even in the form of words never said, of honesty never delivered, of the confession that lives in the interior of someone who has not yet found the courage, or the vocabulary, or the willingness to bring it into the open. It gives you the accurate story, not the story the avoidant constructed, the one with the convenient incompatibilities and the poorly timed circumstances, and the vague sense that something was just not quite right in ways that never fully resolved into specific, honest language. Not the story that placed the weight of the ending somewhere diffuse enough that no one had to hold it clearly. The accurate story, the one where you loved fully and were met partially. The one where your presence was real and their presence was managed. The one where the dynamic was not a failure of compatibility, but a failure of capacity. Their capacity, specifically, for the kind of genuine, sustained, undefended intimacy that the connection was always requiring of them. That story does not require their delivery to be true. It does not require the confession to be spoken aloud for the reality it describes to be the actual reality. The truth of it exists independently of whether the avoidant ever finds the honesty to confirm it. And when you hold that story, the accurate one, the one that places the limitation where it actually lived, the question that tends to reorganize everything becomes available. Not what did I do wrong, not what could I have been differently, not why was I not enough, but simply, what do I do now with everything I have become through this? What you have become through this is not a small thing to reckon with, because the experience of loving an avoidant, of extending genuine care into an insufficient space, of maintaining your own integrity in a dynamic that quietly pressured you towards smallness, of coming through the confusion and the grief and the particular exhaustion of loving someone whose fear was louder than their feeling, that experience does not leave a person unchanged. It leaves them more discerning, more attuned to the specific texture of genuine presence versus managed presence, more capable of feeling, with a precision that bypasses the intellect entirely, the difference between someone who is actually arriving and someone who is performing arrival while keeping the exit pre-calculated. That attunement is not cynicism. It does not arrive as a closing. It arrives as a sharpening, a refinement of the instrument that was already finely tuned, made more precise by the specific education of having been close to someone who was simultaneously real and unavailable, genuine and defended, worth loving and unable to be loved in the way that would have made the love sustainable. The dismissive avoidant, in the silence of their honest interior, knows they sharpened you. They may not use that language. They may not frame it as something they contributed. But in the undefended hours, in the gaps between the performance of self-sufficiency, they feel the specific shape of what the dynamic produced in you, and they recognize it as something that did not exist in its current form before the two of you were in proximity. Your clarity increased. Your tolerance for managed connection decreased. Your ability to recognize the early signatures of emotional unavailability, the subtle signs that were invisible to you before this and are now unmistakable, became part of the permanent equipment you carry into every subsequent space. The dismissive avoidant gave you that, not intentionally, not generously, but actually. The fearful avoidant, in the turbulent, honest interior that they can never quite escape, knows something similar. They know that the experience of being loved by you, of being offered genuine, unperformed, unstrategic care by someone who saw the full complexity of the pattern and chose to extend warmth toward it anyway, changed something, created a reference point, a felt sense of what it could feel like, what it has actually felt like, to be in the presence of someone whose love was not conditional on the performance of okayness. They carry that reference point. It is one of the things that makes the silence loud. Both types would say, if the honesty extended all the way to the edge of what they are capable of feeling, that the experience of being loved by you was instructive in a way that nothing before had been. That your love, whatever it cost you, whatever the dynamic prevented it from becoming, functioned as a kind of evidence. Evidence that the thing they had been most defended against, genuine, mutual, unguarded intimacy, was not only possible but felt, in the brief moments when they could allow themselves to be inside it, without immediately activating the exit, like the most real thing they had encountered. Not comfortable, real. Those are not the same thing, and the distinction matters enormously. Real for a person who has spent a significant portion of their life inside the managed comfort of defended connection is not always pleasant. It is demanding. It requires the presence of a self that has been kept carefully in the background. It produces the vertigo of genuine exposure, the specific dizziness of being actually seen by someone with the clarity and the capacity to see accurately. But real is also, underneath all of that discomfort, unmistakably alive, unmistakably worth something, unmistakably different in quality from the surface level connections that the defense makes more comfortable precisely because they ask for nothing that the defense cannot provide. And both types would have to tell you, if the honesty was complete, that they knew the difference, that they could feel the difference between what you offered and what they had been settling for in previous dynamics. That the specific quality of being with you registered as categorically distinct from the managed, controlled, emotionally contained connections that their pattern had been producing consistently. They knew what they had, they knew it while they had it. Not fully, not with the complete clarity that distance eventually makes available, but enough. Enough to know that what they were in proximity to was not ordinary. That the person in front of them was not someone who could be easily replaced by someone less demanding of genuine presence. And they left anyway, or pulled away anyway, or stayed in body while leaving in every way that matters anyway. Because knowing the value of something and having the capacity to stay inside that value are two entirely different things. And the avoidant, whatever their type, whatever the specific architecture of their particular defense, was equipped for the knowing and not yet equipped for the staying. That is the gap that the honest confession would ultimately name. The gap between recognition and capacity. Between understanding what is real and being able to inhabit that reality without flinching away from the exposure it requires. Between wanting to be the person who stays and having access to the interior resources that staying, genuinely staying, actually demands. It is a real gap. Not an excuse. The gap produced real harm, and real harm is not excused by the psychological explanation of its origin. But real. Genuinely, structurally real in the way that developmental wounds produce genuine structural limitations on what a person can access without sustained, intentional work. The avoidant was limited, not permanently, not irreparably, but in the season of being with you, in the specific conditions of the dynamic you shared, the limitation was the determining factor. The fear was the loudest voice. The exit was the most practiced response. And the love, whatever quality and volume of it actually existed, and it did exist, in both types, in the specific ways their respective patterns permitted, the love was not yet strong enough, or the person not yet developed enough, to override the pattern that had been running longest. What both would say, underneath everything, is something that has no clean or comfortable form, something that does not resolve into a statement that can be received and processed and filed away, something that simply sits, the way genuinely honest things tend to sit, in the space between two people and asks to be witnessed without being fixed. They would say, "I was not ready for you." Not as an apology that expects forgiveness, not as a statement that implies readiness is coming and patience is warranted, simply as the most accurate description of the fundamental condition that shaped everything. They were not ready for the specific quality of presence you brought, not ready for love that did not perform itself, not ready for a person whose standards were the natural expression of genuine self-knowledge rather than the defensive expression of fear. Not ready for the particular invitation of being with someone who made genuine intimacy feel possible in a way that made the absence of it in their own interior more visible than it had ever been. Not ready. And rather than name that, rather than bring that honest, humbling, potentially transformative admission into the space between you, they did what the unready tend to do. They found ways to make the problem about everything except the truth. The truth was simple, as the deepest truths tend to be, underneath the layers of complexity that fear builds around them to keep them from being seen. The truth was that you were the kind of person who required someone to show up, fully, not perfectly, not without struggle or imperfection, or the ordinary difficulty of two real people navigating genuine intimacy, but fully, with the whole self present, with the fear acknowledged rather than acted out, with the love spoken rather than rationed, with the staying chosen consciously, again and again, as the active expression of what was real between you. And they could not do it. Not because you were wrong, not because the love was wrong, not because the connection was a mistake or the hope was unfounded, or the investment was wasted in the way that investments in genuinely wrong things are wasted. Because they were not yet the person that kind of love requires. And rather than begin the work of becoming that person, the real, sustained, uncomfortable identity reorganizing work, They chose the familiar shape of a smaller life. That smaller life is theirs to reckon with now. The silence is theirs, the longing is theirs, the undelivered confession is theirs. The gap between who they were in the dynamic and who the dynamic was asking them to become, that is theirs to sit with in whatever way their current capacity for honest self-examination allows. None of it is yours to carry. You carried enough. You carried the weight of loving someone whose love for you was real, but whose capacity to express and sustain and act from that love was perpetually insufficient. You carried the uncertainty they created. You carried the subtle editing of yourself that the dynamic slowly produced. You carried the hope and the grief of the hope not being met, and the specific exhaustion of maintaining your own integrity inside a space that consistently asked you to be less than yourself. You carried all of that, and you came through it. With your capacity for love intact, with your standards intact, with the full, undiminished, clear-eyed knowing of what you deserve intact. That is not what a person looks like after they were the problem. That is what a person looks like after they survived someone else's limitation and refused to let it become their own.